Hey church, today we are in Galatians chapter 2, and in it we're going to find a continuation of the argument that the Apostle Paul started in Galatians chapter 1, namely defending himself against some of the accusations that have come against him that are causing some of the Galatians to slip into some questionable theology. Again, the question that is going on here is the question of the theology of justification. The doctrine of justification in the Bible and Paul's clear teaching here is that we're saved by faith alone. It's not through any work of our own, but it's through trusting the grace of God. And the problem is the Galatian church is beginning to slip into this teaching that we can be saved by our works, so that we need to add our own kind of good works to the gospel in order to be saved. And Paul says that actually leads to some really dangerous places, and he repudiates it completely. But as he does that, the people who have been sowing this kind of misinformation, this doctrine, have been accusing Paul of being really two accusations. One, that he's preaching a different gospel than Jesus preached, and two, that he's out of step with the rest of the apostles. And so he's going to deal with that here. He's going to deal with the first issue, that he's out of step with the other apostles, in the first part of this chapter. It says, "Then after an interval of 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along also. He had gone 3 years after his conversion experience on the road to Damascus. He went up and met with the council of Jerusalem and the apostles there. And here we are 14 years later, and he goes again. This time he brings along Barnabas and Titus. And they begin to meet and talk, and he begins to address some of the issues that have been, the accusations that have been made against him, that as he goes to the Gentiles, that he's abandoning the faith and he's teaching a different gospel. Well, as they begin to speak about it and talk about it, it says that he's received by the other apostles. It says, verse 7, it says, "But on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised, for he who effectually worked for Peter in his apostleship to the circumcised effectually worked in me also to the Gentiles. And recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas and John," so this is James, Cephas is Peter, and John. These are kind of the three most preeminent apostles and would have been the loudest, strongest voices in the Jerusalem council that were the lead of the churches. It says that who were reputed to be the pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, so that we might go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. So look, the early church, primarily the apostles and most of the disciples, had been ministering to Jews who lived in Jerusalem, who lived in Judea, and who lived in the diaspora, who had gone into the different parts of the world. And they primarily were ministering among them. But Paul had been called to go to the Gentiles largely and to reach these pagan people, the people who had no prior knowledge of the Old Testament or of the covenant of Abraham, people who were totally outside of that, the uncircumcised, right? That's how they viewed the world. The world was separated in two categories. The circumcised, circumcision was a sign of the covenant of God, of the Abrahamic covenant with God, and then the uncircumcised, which was everybody else, the Gentiles. Well, Paul's ministry was primarily to the uncircumcised. But it says here that those are actually the same ministry, just two different callings, two different branches of the same gospel, which Peter and those guys had been called to primarily minister to the circumcised, and the Apostle Paul had been called primarily minister to the Gentile nations. And they says they extended him the right hand of fellowship, and they said, we're in unison, we're in agreement. This is the one church and the one gospel. This is really important to understand. And to understand Paul's ministry overall is you have to understand this idea of the Judaizers, that there were these people who were coming along after Paul would start these churches, these ministries, and they'd come alongside, they'd be a part of the church, and they'd begin to tell people, okay, well, you need to be circumcised. You need to follow the dietary laws. You need to follow the ritual customs of ritual purity and all these kinds of things. And they begin to sow these things that they understood very deeply, thought were a very important part of the covenant. And what would actually happen is it began to sow this dissension in the church, and it would cause churches to fracture and break. And so this was a constant a thorn in the side of the Apostle Paul. He's constantly dealing with these different issues. Well, when Peter actually came to Antioch, they encountered this issue face to face, and that's what Paul deals with in the second part, is this conflict he actually had with the Apostle Peter. It says in verse 11, "But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For prior to the coming of certain men from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles, but when they came, he began to withdraw and hold himself aloof, fearing the party of the circumcision. Here's what happens. Peter comes to Antioch to see the ministry that Paul had started and see the church, and Peter's loving it. He's enjoying the liberty of seeing all these Gentiles come to faith in the Lord. And remember, this is something that Peter had a hand in. He was in Acts chapter 10. Peter was the one who originally God had called to bring the gospel to the Gentiles in the first place. Remember, it was Cornelius' house. Peter he's up on the roof praying as a vision of God laying down this sheet full of animals. He says, come and eat. And it's all these unclean animals. And these would have been off limits to Peter and the dietary covenant that he was following. And God says to him, don't call anything that I've made clean unclean. And so now that was this call to go into the Gentiles and to preach the gospel to them. So now they're being saved, and Paul himself is having this huge impact. Peter comes and sees it, and he loves it. He's joining in their fellowship, and they're eating together and going house to house, which to Jews would have been really scandalous because you weren't supposed to even go into the house of a Gentile. But here Peter is enjoying the fellowship. But then some men come from Jerusalem. It says they come from James. These don't have the same doctrine as James, but they're men who have a certain reputation. They're these Judaizers. And it comes and it says that Peter began to withdraw from the fellowship of saints, and that other people saw him. The rest of the Jews joined him in the hypocrisy, with the result that even Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy. They began to withdraw and say, okay, well, we don't want to eat with them. We don't want to eat the same kind of food. They're not, they're kind of second-class Christians. And Paul calls out Peter in front of everybody. He says, what you're doing is sinful. What you're doing is wrong. That you guys are trying to put these old laws that never saved Jews in the first place on these people. These things that actually Jesus came to rescue us from. You're nullifying God's law of grace. It says in verse 16, nevertheless, knowing that a man is not justified. Remember, this is the doctrine of justification. A man is not justified by the works of the law, but through faith in Christ Jesus. Even we have believed in Christ Jesus so that we may be justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law. So why are you trying to put, circumcision and dietary restrictions and all this kind of stuff on these people? That's not how you're saved. You're justified by Christ through faith alone, by grace alone. And then we get in verse 20, we get where Paul really summarizes such an important part of the whole gospel. And this is one of my favorite memory verses, Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who lives, but Christ who lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. He says, look, all these old predilections, all these old desires, all these old customs, all these old ways of living, all of that, my entire life has been crucified with Christ. And it's not even my life anymore. In fact, my life belongs fully and wholly to Jesus himself. And so I want to bring every part of that through faith into walking in that justification, into walking with Christ, that my life belongs to him and he gets to set the agenda for my whole life. Listen, that's the call of what it means to be a Christian. I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who lives. Okay? Now I'm still here on this earth, but this life that I'm living, it's not my own. I live by faith in Christ Jesus, who died and gave himself for me. Everything I have is his. Everything I have belongs to him, and he gets to steer the ship. He gets to direct me. He gets to call me. And that's what is live the Christian life. So if there's things in your life that are holding you back from fully embracing the gospel, fully walking in things that God has called you, if you're trying to live by some old standards or laws, or things your family put on you, things that your culture's put on you, our job is to crucify all of it and to walk by faith, putting our eyes in him, the author and the finisher of our faith, that we're trusting God. Church, I encourage you and myself, let's walk in faith and trust God with our lives. God bless you.